On this episode of Anything Goes Hokkaido, we welcome Matthew Jones, professional photographer, cameraman, and video editor, and also former ALT or assistant language teacher with the JET program. Matthew has a wonderful perspective on what it's like to live and teach and work in Hokkaido, not only for the government through the ALT JET program, but also filming videos for the Hokkaido government and the nature department. His work takes him all over Japan, especially this island, and he's one of the most well-traveled people that I know, not only through his work, but his adventurous spirit. You're sure to enjoy this episode and learn a lot. I know that I did. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this time with Matthew Jones and the Anything Goes Hokkaido video and audio podcast. Hello and welcome to Anything Goes Hokkaido video and audio podcast. I'm Delana Miyazaki, and today it's just me. My co-host Shinya is not available, so we're going to be interviewing Matthew Jones, who has been a resident in Hokkaido for how long now have you been
4
here?
years.
4 years. Such a newbie.
Yep.
And actually, I think you've got more experience with traveling around Hokkaido and some other unique things than anybody I know.
Really interesting. I think there's probably people that you know that have more experience than me.
Well, maybe just because of their length of time here, but in the short time you've been here, well,
in the short time that I've been here, I have certainly made my rounds around the island quite a few times.
Okay, so let's kind of back up and start at the beginning. Like, what brought you to Japan and specifically Hokkaido in the first place?
So the initial thing that brought me to Japan in terms of having an interest in Japan was, I think probably like many people, in some degrees, a kind of a combination of being interested in Japanese culture from experiencing it through to some degree anime. A lot of people know Hayao Miyazaki's films. Kind of in middle school was the first time I ever had any contact with that and found it really interesting in a way that it just kind of presented art and presented even the musical quality of it in a way that you don't really encounter in, but maybe you'll find it more often now, but I would say probably 10 to 20 years ago, you certainly wouldn't encounter it very often in American media. And then in addition to that, I had met some Japanese friends at a summer camp that I went to in Colorado when I was in middle school. And their English ability was pretty limited. My Japanese ability was totally non-existent. However, despite that, we were able to kind of build an immediate friendship faster than I had experienced with most other people. And at the end of the summer camp, they all performed. There was a group of them from Fukuoka, about 15 students, performed the Yosakoi dance, which is pretty famous as a traditional dance in all out through Japan. And I remember there was something aesthetic about the dance that I really was kind of struck by and really stuck with me for a long time. So in college, I majored as an international relations major, and you have to take language studies as a requirement to graduate. So I decided to take Japanese as something I'd always been interested in, but growing up kind of in a rural Colorado area was never available to me.
Sure. The language is available to me as well. We're very limited in my schools.
Yeah.
I was like, would have totally taken Japanese had it been available.
Had it been available, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I took Spanish, which I have no regrets about, but it's difficult to use out here.
Well, yeah. I also took 2 years of Spanish in high school simply because I lived in Florida and I thought it would be practical, but it really didn't help foster many conversations in real life.
Yeah, I think that's probably something you encounter as an English teacher in Japan as well. For me, as a high schooler taking Spanish, I was not particularly interested in learning Spanish, which has a significant impact on your ability to actually learn a language of
for sure.
the degree and interest you have in it now. Now, going back to the US, I would love to continue taking Spanish. I think it would be kind of a beautiful language to learn and certainly would open up a lot more conversations.
Right. Same
now
here.
as an adult, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think that experience, though, for me as an English teacher as well, was helpful in understanding my students who are
Yes,
maybe in the situation where they don't want to be taking English classes
absolutely.
necessarily, and trying to find ways to do it better or
Yes.
get them
Hmm.
interested, or at least make it not be boring textbook style. Okay,
Certainly.
so you had the advantage of being in the slightly younger generation and having exposure to Miyazaki Hayao movies and animation and Japanese culture. There was none of that when I was living in the US. I think
Yes.
Power
I was.
Rangers was probably the only
Yes, and I grew
thing
up
even remotely
loving.
Japanese.
Yes, I loved the Power Rangers growing up, and only after moving to Japan found out that it was of Japanese influence that brought it to the US. I had no idea that it was based off of, Kamen Rider and all of those kind of classic Japanese shows here.
I don't know why, but I think I picked up on that a little bit just from watching the show. Like they had the American version where the acting, they when they weren't
Yeah.
in their costumes, that they were actually like American actors, and that part
Yes.
was very Americanized, with the
Yes.
production. But then you just jump into this totally Japanese Kamen Rider style fighting scenes, and the monsters. It's like, okay, this is not normal, but cool. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
it's certainly not found in other children's shows. I mean,
no.
if you go back and watch something like Godzilla now, it's very obvious. Oh, absolutely, this is a Japanese TV show. But as a 6-year-old, I had no comprehension of that.
Right. I was in high school when those first started coming out. But yeah, like I came here with, there was no Google, there was no YouTube. I knew nothing about Japanese culture other than just the typical stereotypes.
Yeah, I
Before
can
I came.
imagine that for you coming in a kind of in the beginning when there was no Google Translate. You weren't able to walk around with a smartphone and
Nope.
decode all of the signs with your
No.
phone camera. That it would have been a much. Perhaps, did you find it isolating at first when you first came to Japan?
Well, in a way, I guess it was, because I lived on the outskirts of Sapporo, and I spent my first 10 days in Japan actually traveling with a group of musicians doing a kind of tour.
Okay.
And so we were 5 days in Tokyo and 5 days in Osaka.
Mm-hmm.
And just to time reference it, the first day in Osaka was 9/11. So we were eating dinner after the concert. It was my first time to ever try curry rice or any kind of curry in my life.
Yes.
And I was 21. And my team leader, she was Japanese, and she had one of those like little stick cell phones.
Yes.
And a little message went across saying that an airplane had hit the Twin Towers, and that's all we knew. And I was imagining like a Cessna plane or something bouncing off the side. And It wasn't until the morning when we got up and went out of where we were staying that we saw the newspapers and the headlines. And, it was just all TV news and that kind of thing. And I didn't even know what was really happening until I was riding the airplane up to Hokkaido 5 days later, and finally got to watch news on TV in the airplane. And it was a bit crazy then. And I came up to Sapporo and was living on the outskirts and didn't go anywhere or do anything for the first few days, except my roommate took me to the onsen the first night.
Okay.
I was like, the onsen is a hot spring where you get naked in a public bath with people that you do not know, which is easier than getting naked with people you do know, I think, if you're not used to it.
It's also very different being naked in a culture where it's not
taboo.
Seen, exactly. It's not taboo, but it's not even thought about as being particularly different. Everybody's there naked in the atmosphere of, this is the atmosphere where everybody should be naked.
Yeah.
So you don't have this sense of people looking at you like, that guy's here, why is he here? No, this is just normal.
And that's a key word, where you should be naked. So for me, it was extremely liberating coming from the US and a culture where you do see nudity in like movies and sometimes now TV especially, but those bodies in the productions and the magazines, they're perfect. whether it's from Photoshop or just being genetically lucky.
Yes.
And then you never see normal, everyday, average bodies in the nude. And
Yes.
so you look at your own body and just go, what's wrong with me? And especially like a girl growing up with those kind of complexes, it was so liberating to see all the little old obachans, we call them, the little old grandmothers, and the younger women, and like all these body types and the battle scars of having children or surgery.
Yes.
And nobody's looking at each other like judgmentally or
Absolutely.
anything. It's just like, it was so liberating to see normal bodies and then think, I'm not nearly as bad as I thought. Or the only weird thing is occasionally you will find people that want to practice their English will try and talk to you while you're naked in the bath.
I have had that many times. Not every time. It's not every time I go that happens, but once in 10 times when sitting there, and you're especially the longer that you've been in Hokkaido, you start to go to onsens with that real mentality of, I'm going to take a break from life. Just kind of sit down and relax, and then you kind of close your eyes, and then somebody kind of moses their way over and says, oh, where are you from? And then you're like, I'm from Sapporo. And then you kind of have this moment where they're like, that wasn't the answer that I was expecting. And then they ask me again, no, but where are you from? And then they want me to say something like the US or England or Australia. Yeah,
I do the same response. I'm from Sapporo.
Yes.
Sometimes I'm perfectly happy to talk to people. I really am a people person and enjoy that. And I've made some actually really good friends from that kind of connection. In fact, I'm going to be starting a new job in another month in the fall, teaching at a medical university here. And the woman that got me that job, we actually met in the bath some years ago.
Yes. Absolutely.
So you can make good connections there too. But if anybody has good hints on how to avoid conversations if you don't want to be accosted as a English teacher in the bath, please send us those at anythinggoes.hokkaido@gmail.com or our social media. But yeah, so my experience coming to Hokkaido before smartphones, and it was just the beginning when you could make long distance audio calls for free. Maybe it wasn't even really available the first year or two, because I still remember paying for the phone cards. And right before I came, some of my friends who were planning to come here called my future teammates and coworkers on the phone long distance. And it's like a $200 phone call for maybe 2 hours.
Wow.
Yeah. And they knew it was going to cost that much. But yeah, back in the day, you had to like buy a prepaid card just to make sure you didn't like go way over budget, and that tended to be cheaper rates. But I spent a lot of money on phone cards talking to people. And then when we started to have availability to audio chats, before video chats, before Skype came around. So it was a different world. And I relied heavily on other people to either speak to me in English or I remember studying the hiragana and katakana after I got here. I tried to learn before I came, but I was taking American Sign Language and Greek for my degree in university. And I was studying for a Greek final, and my future coworker, she had come for a visit back to our college, my senpai, and she brought me like photocopied pages from a kana textbook. Kana is easy or something. And I opened that up. I was like, okay, I'm going to study Japanese. And my brain just went, if you want to pass your Greek finals, don't even think about it. So I'm like sitting there praying in the coffee shop, like, oh, please help me to learn Japanese quickly when I get there. So I did nothing. I couldn't read any of it.
Wow.
So I would sit on the subway and like practice reading the simpler kanji. And we were on a drive taking our senior coworker to a ferry in Tomakomai, which is about a couple hours, I guess, from where we were. And on the way there and the way back, I actually memorized all of the katakana in about 4 hours.
That's pretty impressive. It took me a few weeks to really finally feel like I had hiragana down. Katakana
Well,
still
hiragana I did
trips me
first,
up.
and that
Okay.
took me probably the same. But then the katakana, which is exactly the same phonetical sounds, is just
Yes.
different shape. And for people who are listening to this or watching and don't really know much about the Japanese language yet, which would be a lot of the world, I think, there are two phonetical alphabet systems. One is used just in general, it's hiragana. And then the second one is exactly the same except for the shape. And that is used specifically for foreign words. So anything that's coming from English or French or German is going to be spelled in this katakana.
The katakana.
And then
Yes.
you have the kanji. Sometimes they're called Chinese characters. I prefer Japanese characters because they're quite different from Chinese characters.
They have evolved quite a bit since the
In many
original
ways.
Chinese characters, yes.
However, unlike Chinese or Korean, I believe, where one character has one reading, one sound, the Japanese characters actually have the original Chinese reading, as well as maybe two other ways to read it in Japanese.
If not up to 30 other ways to read it.
30 other ways. So any character, when you combine it with other characters, it's going to be read so differently.
Yes.
That makes Japanese very challenging to be proficient at in the reading and writing aspect.
Yes, Japanese in just the hiragana and katakana world is relatively simple. Far simpler, I think, than English is.
Yes.
The sounds that the mouth produces are limited to about 48. However, when you combine it with the Chinese characters that have been adapted to fit the language that they were not initially designed for, it creates problems, which I find absolutely remarkable that Japan has been able to, for hundreds and hundreds of years, had almost universal literacy rate for a reading and writing system that is not by any means designed for the country that it is functioning in.
Wow, I've never really considered it from that point of view, but I also am very impressed that people learn to be fluent and proficient in this language, even if that's the only one they speak. It's really incredible, the tricks your brain has to go through to
Yes, absolutely.
figure these things out. And you and I have worked together in settings that required pretty high level of Japanese fluency, and I've always been really impressed at your level because you're definitely beyond me.
That's not the case.
I feel like it is.
No, I think the level of Japanese that I have is impressive only in a specific setting of working kind of on a film set. There's a lot of specialized language that I had zero comprehension of before starting working as a cameraman 2 years ago, but as a result of necessity have kind of built into my repertoire. However, it's not Japanese that you encounter in any other setting. And so from kind of an outside perspective, it looks like I have this incredible mastery of the language. However, it's only in a very specific field where I'm able to function fluently. And then outside of that, I struggle just as much as everybody else.
Oh, okay. We need to hang out outside of the studio then, because you absolutely just floored me with your ability to communicate and to translate on the fly some very complex things. But working with Matthew Jones today on the show in the studio has been incredible, like the best experiences I've had.
Oh, thank you.
And it's not flattery, it is honest truth. When you are a narrator in the studio and there is no other native English speaker anywhere to be found to consult with, and you come across something that is just not reading quite right, and most of the time I feel like I know what it is. I find the problem. If my client trusts me, I don't have to argue too much. I can just say, hey, this doesn't sound right. We need to change it. This would be better. But it's a lot of mental gymnastics to do that on the fly.
Yes.
And then I'd say about half the time, if not more, the client will either argue against changing it because they don't understand it, or maybe it was approved through a long process already of people that should have known better, or maybe just they don't. And occasionally end up reading things in a way that makes me cringe, knowing that it's not. But you always have to choose your battles. But having you in the studio, able to back me up on things, or many cases you had suggestions that were even better than what I had come up with. That's always been very refreshing, and I leave those jobs feeling like 100% confident that we did the best thing we could. So, if anybody needs an amazing professional in-studio cameraman / editor, Matthew Jones is your guy.
Oh, thank you. No, it's absolutely a concerted effort in that atmosphere. I have been incredibly impressed at your ability to function as an English narrator in this setting, particularly in Sapporo, which is not necessarily the most developed film atmosphere in Japan. Most of what functions professionally in a production unit is Tokyo or Kyoto or Osaka. However, Sapporo, being separate from the main island of Japan, has developed its kind of own atmosphere here as well. However, it certainly has less English influence and kind of less of a resource for English speakers in that world. But to be able to work with the material that you've had for so long and develop your own kind of way of making the best out of it you can, because oftentimes the beginning is quite difficult. Rough drafts are very rough.
Oh my goodness,
most of the work that I've been doing as a cameraman in Hokkaido is with the Ministry of the Environment, producing content for the national parks here. And the Ministry of the Environment has their own approved translation for all of the signage and for all of the different location names within Hokkaido. And the approved translation does not necessarily mean it is the best translation. However, it's the one that the government has decided is the standards to be used. And as a native English speaker, oftentimes you'll come across words or even grammatical punctuation or the capitalization of it that is not natural. And you'll make a suggestion, actually, these words shouldn't be stuck together. They're two separate words that should be split apart, which seems to be an easy fix. When you read it out loud, it doesn't even sound any different. However, when you've got it on the page and you're printing it, these should be separate. And then oftentimes you'll be surprised with the kind of the resistance that you meet because it doesn't meet the approved standard. And working in that world can be difficult.
It has been a challenge and occasionally quite stressful, or especially for me, the way I look at it is that my voice is very recognizable, and I don't want to do something that's going to be embarrassing or decrease the quality of my portfolio, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I really try my best. For my own sake, it's a bit selfish, but also I really want to elevate the level, the quality of work here when we're representing Hokkaido, especially, or any part of Japan. I've done work with other things outside of Hokkaido as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, it's an interesting world, and
it is.
It's a culture that you don't really encounter in any other field, I feel.
I think so. Yeah, working as in media production in Japan for a Japanese company, I think gives you a different perspective than if you were to work independently within Japan. Kind of the rules that you're bound by, and kind of the creativity that you're able to express is a little bit different.
Right. So I'm a freelancer, therefore I don't really have as many rules to follow because I can always accept a job or not, and kind of demand certain things. Or just, decide that job is not for me. But in your case, you're working full-time for a Japanese company a couple of years now. Is there anything you'd like to share with us about the pros and cons or the advice?
I would say that probably the ideal environment to work in Japan would be, if you can, work in Japan for a non-Japanese company.
Mm-hmm.
It's and this is one thing that I really appreciated about working with the JET program, is that they do a very good job of, on the institutional level, it's different for everybody when they actually get here and they're working kind of on a personal level with their board of education or the teachers that they're working with. But on an institutional level of creating basic work protections for the people coming here, they prevent ALTs from working overtime, which in Japan is a pretty harsh environment of the expectation to work unpaid overtime as just kind of the general way things work. And working as an ALT, that was never an issue for me. However, when I made the switch to working as a cameraman in Sapporo, as I was interviewing for the company, they mentioned to me, you will be working more than you've probably ever worked in your life. And my idea was, well, 40 hours a week that I've worked up until now was, that's not bad at all. I can do more than that. That's fine. However, sometimes when you work 80 to 100 hours a week, you realize that that's quite, it wears on you physically, and then not being reimbursed for that can be pretty mentally straining as well.
Yes, and I think people who are not familiar with that part of Japanese culture might actually be scratching their heads or their ears going, did I hear that right? 80 to 100 hours a week is actually not unheard of. It's not even that uncommon.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the pressure here with the societal, everything must be equal, don't stand out, even if you have legal rights or recourses to take your vacation days or to leave on time, because everyone else is going to be continue working. If you try to do the, I would say, independent American mentality, at least, of, well, this is my right and I can take off at the end of the working day when I want to, and I don't have to work overtime. That could be true, but you probably will experience a lot of pressure from the people around you, or you will be not accepted as the normal part of the team. You might not even be able to keep your job long. I'm not sure about that.
So what has made it so difficult for me, and I am all through college as well, I've always been a very firm believer that rest is a critical component of success, and having free time where you're not at all trying to really improve or function on a work level, and having time that's completely unrelated to that, to be able to express yourself freely and to be able to grow in ways that you're not really expecting is necessary. And I kind of assumed that I would be able to some degree as an individual, incorporate that into the work atmosphere that I'm working now, and be able to perhaps influence the other people around me and kind of find some sort of middle ground to work with there. What has made that not be the case, though, is that the company that I work for, and I think this is probably true for a lot of Japanese companies, is that we are working with the least amount of people required to do the absolute most amount of work. And this kind of comes down to the company functioning financially. Hiring more people is not necessarily within their budget. And so in order to kind of have everybody make the amount of income that they're guaranteed to, it requires us to work more than we would really be expected to in an American environment. And to be able to step back from that and then suddenly say, you know what, I'm going to take next week off, or I'm going to take this weekend off. If you have somebody to cover for you, is really easy to do. However, if you're working in an environment where there is nobody to cover for you, and you were to say, next Saturday we have a shoot scheduled, however, it's my girlfriend's birthday, I'd like to take that day off. Suddenly, nobody is going to that shoot because the other two people that you're working with also have different shoots on the other side of the island that they have to be at. So it creates this environment where it's not just that you feel pressured not to take work off, it's no longer even possible to take that work off. And so that can be pretty stressful, and kind of it wears on you for a while, I think.
And do you feel that is fairly common, not just with your company, but across the board?
Within the media production world that I have encountered in Sapporo, I have not worked at all in Tokyo or in Osaka. I would say that's generally universal. And particularly within Sapporo, and this is kind of not just limited to film or media, it's kind of applies to all work environments in Hokkaido, is that most of the younger generation growing up here, once they reach a working age after graduating from high school or from college, they will then move to a larger city outside of Hokkaido. So there's kind of a continual drain of a younger population within Hokkaido that's constantly moving to either Tokyo or some of the larger cities like Osaka. And so there's just no new generation coming up. So for example, in my company, I'm 26, the next youngest person is 46, and there's nobody in between. And then above him, the next youngest person is in their 50s. And then above that, everybody's 60s and 70s, which is an entirely different world of thinking versus, I mean, most of the people that I work with, their base level for film production is 16 millimeter film. So they're still functioning on the idea that 100 meters of film costs this much. You'll burn through 100 meters of film in about 2.5 minutes. So how much film should you shoot in a day? Whereas now, it's
a completely different.
It's completely different. Yeah, so the equipment that we use is different.
8K and digital. And...
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. I also have spent a good deal of time working on location filming with different crews.
Yes.
And I would have to say the youngest person on any of those camera crews tends to be maybe 30s or 40s, and then it's like up towards close to retirement age or even beyond retirement age. And the schedules can be quite hard. For me, I'm usually on location from 3, 4, 5 days. 6 is the longest I've been on. And they do their best for me, because I have to look fresh on camera, to let me have rest times in the car when we're driving from place to place, or not demand a whole lot. So I'm not carrying heavy equipment or having to be on all that time. I know that my coworkers, who are the cameraman and the sound engineers, have a much heavier burden than mine. But even I can get a little burnt out after a few days of, waking up at 3:30 or 4 in the morning to go dry kelp on the beach, and then having to film a sunset, at 7, and then like maybe a dinner evening scene. And so you're just on a really tough schedule. And then once my part is done, I come home, but these people are also editing and racing towards deadlines. And
absolutely, yeah. And oftentimes most of the shoots will overlap, so as soon as you've finished, you have got no turnover, and you're immediately off on a different location as well.
Right. Well, even when we would get back to the hotel at the end of a filming day, for me, it's like, okay, maybe we have dinner together and then time to go to bed and have a bath in the onsen, whatever. But my coworkers will be charging batteries, checking the film of the day, making sure that they got everything. And that's more and more hours of work. And so it's definitely a sleep deprivation culture.
Yes, I average far less hours of sleep than I would like and have ever been used to in my life. I have noticed that my body has gotten somewhat used to having less amounts of sleep than I had growing up, but I don't know how much of that is getting used to it, or how much of it is kind of forgetting what a nice baseline is.
Well, I've never had a normal sleep schedule that I can recall. I have a free running sleep schedule. So operating on varied amounts of sleep without a steady baseline is just my MO. So I can't sympathize or empathize too much in that regard. Or I can completely empathize just because I do it to myself. But
Yeah, and that's different for everybody. What's healthy and what's not.
So right now it sounds like this whole experience working as an ALT, where you've got guidelines and protections that allow you to actually have more of a normal lifestyle, sounds pretty cushy. Why did you switch?
That's a good question. Yeah, so I guess probably to answer your first question, which you initially asked, which I hadn't really addressed, of being an ALT.
Yeah, let's go back to that, because
okay,
a lot of people who are maybe going to be listening to this are interested in becoming ALTs. What does ALT stand for, actually?
So it stands for Assistant Language Teacher. In Japan, the title has changed over the years. At one point it was Assistant English Teacher. However, not all language instruction in Japan, particularly in Hokkaido, is just English now. There are ALTs who are requested to teach Russian as well, particularly in some of the kind of farther north port cities like Wakkanai or Nemuro. Right. They have a fair amount of trade that goes along with the Russian sailors as well that kind of come through the area. But the ALT, you are, as the name suggests, an assistant language teacher. So you are traditionally paired with as an elementary school teacher, you'd be paired with the homeroom teacher, who's then teaching one group of usually somewhere between 20 and 40 students, kind of all of the generalized subjects like you would find in an American education system as well. And then when they teach their English classes, you get brought in as a way to kind of facilitate the English, to provide some sort of native speaker element, thank you, into that world. And the way that it functions is different for every school. So there's some schools where you will be asked to basically handle all of the instruction on your own. When you walk into the classroom, the homeroom teacher will always supposed to be present. Legally, they have to be present because you're not actually a licensed educator in Japan, so you're not allowed to be left alone with students. But they might not be present in their participation. And so you'll kind of have to be in charge of the class, provide all of the content. How will the students engage with English? How will you present the material that is either in the textbook or supplement it with something else that you would like to bring into the classroom? And that amount of freedom also varies from school to school. Sure. So I was teaching in a town called Engaru, and teaching in kind of a sub-district of Engaru called Ikutahara, which has only about a population of 2,500 people spread out over a fairly large area in kind of the rural countryside. So most of the students that I were teaching, their parents were either dairy farmers or had some sort of kind of in the fishing industry or kind of in an agricultural industry. So their perspective of learning English was that it's something that they do not need to learn, which by most accounts, their encounter of native English speakers is limited to maybe 1, 2, or 3 people per year outside of myself working as an English teacher there. Sure. And so for them, there's not a real sense of necessity, which I think is by all means understandable. I had the kind of the same perspective learning Spanish. However, growing up in Colorado, where there's a very large population of native Spanish speakers, is even less acceptable for me to have that kind of mentality. But you do, so yeah. Yes. So it can be very difficult to teach because not many of the students are interested in learning it. Right. But for my situation, I was given a lot of freedom by the Board of Education and by the teachers that I was working with. And I taught elementary school from first grade up to middle school, which is the American equivalent of freshman year at high school. Right. And I taught at 5 schools in kind of all around this different region. And each of those schools I taught on a different day. Okay. And then so you were at a different school from Monday through Friday?
basically.
Yes. Yeah. So I rotated through each of these schools, and I kind of did a weird schedule as well, where I would teach half days at some of the elementary schools and then switch to the middle school in the afternoon.
I see.
Because they're usually right next to each other. So you just kind of
yeah.
walk down the street and then you're at the middle school.
Right.
So it would make preparing for classes pretty difficult, because you kind of be thinking, okay, I've got first graders in the morning. I've got to do like numbers 1 through 10. And then suddenly I've got middle schoolers in the afternoon, and I have to teach, how do you correctly use relative pronouns. And so kind of doing this mental acrobatics of trying to create content that is actually age appropriate while bouncing around through all of these different age groups took a while for me to get any sort of sense of proficiency at. And I only was an ALT for 2 years. And I think I think that by my first year was the first time that I had developed any sense of confidence in the classroom. I would say that the entire first year that I taught was a complete year of experimentation, most of it not successful,
did you have any
fairly
training?
Demoralizing.
Did you have any training as a teacher before coming into this job?
I had zero training as a teacher. All of my training was purely as a student in the classroom.
Right. Yeah. So I think I as well only took a 2-week TESOL course before I came here.
Okay.
And other than tutoring in college, I really didn't have any teaching credentials or experience. So definitely, if you're looking to come here as an English teacher, be it the JET ALT program or independently like I did, or working through a school, there's a lot of learning on the job.
I would say it's entirely learning on the job. And for me, that was pretty difficult. I really enjoyed being able to have the opportunity to be in a classroom with students, and it gave me kind of a very valuable set of experience that has helped me now as a cameraman working in Japan, because it allowed me to basically, in a very short period of time, experience elementary school and middle school life in Japan, which is, this is the foundation of Japanese society that every person in Japan has experienced growing up while they're going through their most critical development process as a child into an adult.
Right.
And so for 2 years to be able to do this and to be able to see, the way that the teacher's room is set up in an elementary and middle school classroom, or in the teacher's room, is the way that almost all Japanese companies are set up. That you will have basically the most important person in the room will be seated here, and then to their, the left or their right will always be the person who's in charge of finances. And then you kind of got like the vice principal, and this usually is basically the same for all Japanese work environments. And then
I never considered that before, but that is 100% correct. And walking into the teacher's staff room at any school is a bit mind-boggling at first. I think, like,
at first
what
it absolutely
is going on here? And I have not spent that much time at like institutionalized schools.
Yes. Okay.
But I've been in enough teachers' rooms and have always found them quite uncomfortable, honestly, as far as like the atmosphere.
Yeah, and the atmosphere, I'm teaching at 5 schools. The atmosphere at each school was very different. And the other thing that's very prevalent in public sector in Japan, be it teachers or working at kind of for example, a state-run hospital or working in the civil service, is the notion of tenkin, which is basically movement between different work offices. So usually transfers. Public servants will usually be at one given place for a period of 3 to 5 years, and then they will be transferred to a different office. And this kind of functions systematically as a way to prevent corruption of everybody. If they're in the same environment and they're kind of constantly working with the same people, then even though they're public servants, they may perhaps have outside influence from the relationships that they've developed that will influence the way that they're perhaps working with students or working with in kind of a civil service working with welfare funding, things like that. And so they get moved. And this will basically mean every single year, somewhere between 1 or 10 of the teachers that you're working with will just suddenly change, and then new teachers will come in. So the environment is always changing.
Right.
And that can either be good or it can be really difficult. I encountered both of those where kind of one of the teachers I had worked with, we had a fairly poor chemistry. Just kind of the ways that we approached teaching were pretty drastically different. And it made working with each other quite difficult. But then, however, when she was then transferred and a new teacher came in, it kind of created a new opportunity to try and develop a new relationship. However, on the exact opposite, I had another teacher who I had an excellent time working with, and we functioned really well in the classroom. And I felt like we had really developed this kind of useful and dynamic set of teaching patterns, and then they were transferred and somebody else new came in with zero influence on that world at all. So it's difficult.
Yeah, for sure. And this, thank you for that explanation. The tanking or transfer system that's so prevalent in Japanese companies, and especially the government side, has always been baffling to me a little bit on why they insist people move every 3 to 5 years.
Yes. Yeah.
I do get that, especially from the trying to avoid corruption and such within government work. And of course, teachers are included in that civil servant role. But from a personal life, family life perspective, you end up with a lot of families who get split. Especially with, like, if the husband is traditionally the one earning the main income and in that kind of position, rather than uproot the entire family and sell your home or rent it out, etc., depending on your situation, the other partner and children will remain behind so they can stay in their school system. And you'll have one partner living on their own, and you're also paying like double rent in many cases, and so it's not really getting you ahead financially. And in fact, just on the civil servant, I have a friend who works in like Tokyo area, and both she and her husband were working as civil servants in different departments. And the husband got an offer to be transferred overseas to Singapore for 3 years. So the family decided to take it so that their children could have a multicultural experience. However, the wife, even though she's a civil servant, was not allowed to do any work. She was not allowed to get another job while overseas. She had to write reports for her job just to show she was doing some kind of self-improvement or something to keep her position, but not earning the income. So her position's guaranteed that she'll be able to return back to work when she gets there. But I felt that was extremely unjust when you have people working for the same system that you require one person to just basically give up their career for that period of time so the other spouse can further theirs. It's a bit crazy to me.
It is.
The amount of control.
Yeah. And I think the system that exists here is one of the main reasons why, if you watch any sort of anime or any sort of Japanese television drama, in most cases, if has to do with kind of a middle school or a high school age main character, you will almost never see their father figure in the drama or in the anime at all. They're almost always totally non-existent.
Yeah.
And that's because that's generally the case in kind of that normal work life family dynamic in Japan, is that the husband, if he is the main kind of breadwinner for the house, will not be present. Exactly.
Whether they're transferred to a completely different area, or they're just working overtime, or having to go out to drinking parties to keep their work relationships established. I think the presence of the main worker is not felt at home like we would expect in other cultures. So
Yes, I
that
think
is something
that's
to be
true.
aware of. But if you are going to join the ALT or JET program, as it's also known, what does JET stand for?
JET is Japan Exchange Teaching, if
Right. See,
I
it's a very
believe is what
common
it is.
misunderstanding that you would stand for English teachers, but
English, yes, exchange.
Japan
Although there
exchange.
are, exactly, there's nobody coming from Japan going to the US to teach Japanese,
No.
which it's not that kind of exchange. However, the JET program is kind of an interesting thing where it's been around, I think, for close to 40 years in Japan, not quite 40 years. And it functions nominally as a way to facilitate English learning in Japan. And by an objective standpoint, it has not been very successful in terms of increasing English comprehensive levels in Japan. However, as a cultural exchange platform, I think that the JET program is quite successful. It allows individuals from many different English-speaking companies, not just the US. However, the US provides the majority of the applicants for the program. There are participants from South Africa, there are participants from Jamaica, there are participants from England, from all around the world where somebody who speaks English to come to Japan, to live here, and to be able to interact with a younger generation of people who, for many of the areas in Japan, their only direct influence of a non-Japanese perspective will be provided for them by that English exchange teacher.
Right.
And so it gives you, I think, a phenomenal opportunity to be a cultural ambassador that you can use or abuse, one of the two. And so there's a lot of responsibility with being a cultural ambassador of what kind of culture will you represent. For example, being a American citizen who is white and who is a male coming to Japan and being in a small town where I am the only American citizen living in that town, to then represent to all of the people that I'm working with and interacting with what is going on in the US. During a time where I first came here in 2016, I had been here for about 2 months, and then that was when President Trump was then elected. And at that point in time in Japan, there was a lot of anxiety about President Trump being elected because of remarks that he had made regarding to the military bases that the US has in Japan. So Japan as a country is limited by their constitution to not have a outward focused military. They can have a self-defense force, which is what it nominally is. And practically it is a military by all respects. However, they rely heavily on the security that the US provides, particularly so within the sense of Japan and how it relates to Russia, South Korea, North Korea, and China. And so for President Trump during that period of time, before he had been elected, to say that the US should not be funding any of Japan's protection services was a fairly large statement to be felt across Japan's country from a security perspective. And to be in this small town and to kind of suddenly have this sense of tension regarding Japan's security nationally, and then being asked questions by parents of, well, what do you think about President Trump? What do you think about Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan? And to realize that the words that you use there actually have some degree of impact on how these people then perceive the U.S. You as a person is interesting, but can be kind of a difficult dynamic to walk. And I've really been feeling that quite now of how should I talk to people in Japan about what's going on in the U.S. with regards to racial tension. And in being a white American citizen, the perspective that I have to offer on that is very limited and not by any means comprehensive and I don't have the authority to then say this is how it is in the US, because
Right.
from most of the perspective, I just don't know, or I've never experienced it.
That's 100% true. And in my case, even when it comes to questions about pronunciation of English,
Yes.
I became very aware early on here after meeting so many different people from other countries that speak English, like New Zealand and Australia, Jamaica,
Yes.
etc., that the American way, or even the Midwest American way of saying something, is not like the only way to do it. So
Yes.
even if I feel sometimes my students or friends are maybe even just making a mistake with their pronunciation, I tend to couch it in the sense of, well, this is how we say it where I'm from. But that could be a British English pronunciation, or perhaps, because
Yes.
honestly, I don't know. And so when it comes to trying to talk about, and I generally do not talk about politics or religion or those things if I can avoid them, just find it's less tension all around. But when you get asked direct questions and you need to have an answer, I do try to just let the one thing I always come to is you cannot generalize America, to one kind of, like, Japan is a very homogenous culture in many ways still, after being a closed country and still being a closed country in many ways, that you can generalize things, even if you shouldn't, to how the culture is here. But in the US, you have so much diversity, and people of color will have a very different experience than someone who's like you and I, growing up in the way that we have. So I always just like, you can't generalize it. Everybody's different. You have to ask that person, or try to point them in the direction of people that might have more valid opinions. I don't know. It's a really, really tough thing to answer.
It's really difficult. Yeah. And I don't necessarily know if I could say you can generalize Japan. However, when you're talking about the experience of the US, there are things that just have no cultural equivalent here.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can be difficult to talk about something, for example, that you have almost no vocabulary to talk about in Japanese.
Right.
And yeah, it's difficult.
Yes. So we are kind of getting close to an hour mark for this episode. But Matthew, we really appreciate that you taught us about being an ALT and the experiences in rural Hokkaido. Also, what it's like to work for a Japanese company in the film production industry.
Okay.
And I feel like we've just scratched the surface with you.
Yeah, it wasn't.
Like,
I
on
could
the
say a
many
lot more.
things I know you could. And I would love to have you back on the show again sometime down the line. But
absolutely.
If you have questions for Matthew, is there a way that people might be able to reach you if they want to know more? Or do you have any kind of like social media presence or anything that you're trying to promote?
I am on Instagram, although I almost never upload anything. Almost all of the content that I produce now is kind of contractually not owned by me, so I'm not necessarily active. But if you say,
oh, we lost your sound. Let me unmute you.
Sorry.
There you go.
I had my phone on my space bar to relieve the temporary unmute, and I just moved that.
Okay.
Yeah. My Instagram name is Matthew Rob Jones. No spaces.
Okay.
Receive any message requests there.
H-E-W, Rob, R-O-W?
R-O-B.
Yes. R-O-B. Sorry, yes. Yeah, early morning for me here. So Matthew Rob Jones, Instagram, you can find him there. And definitely he's living an interesting life as a cameraman in Japan. So we look forward to hearing more of your adventures down the line. As always, you can find us on Instagram at Anything Goes Hokkaido. Also Twitter, we don't really post there directly. So Instagram or Facebook, those handles will be the best way to reach us. Of course, email at gmail.com. I am Delana Miyazaki on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook would be Delana Live for my professional artist page. Yes, I am known as the voice of Sapporo, even if I made that name up myself, but I do more than half of the announcements for public transportation in the city and beyond. So I think
you can't come here and not hear your voice.
It would be very difficult. You'd have to be isolated to driving a car and not going in public.
Yes.
So yes, thank you so much, Matthew. And everyone, if you're out there keep on keeping on. And this is Anything Goes Hokkaido. Shitake.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome, Matthew. Thank you. So I'll just stop our recording now. And that was great. As always, we give a huge thank you to everyone who makes this podcast possible, especially our viewers and listeners. Thank you so much. If you would like to be on the show, please contact us at anythinggoeshokkaido@gmail.com, and be sure to check out our Patreon campaign and see what special goodies wait you there. I'll have to put something up, actually. Okay, guys, you hang in there tight. We're going to get through this, and see you next week.